Thank you very much, and thank you for joining us today in the presentation, and indeed the advocacy work around this issue, which I think has been very, very important from the unions, particularly in that in some cases it's representing those who may not yet be members of the union or be in a position to be, but recognising that there is a whole cohort of workers affected. And I had a few points. I think what came across very strongly, and I thank you for making it so clear, was that it's not simply a matter, as we've outlined, that the deterrent is inadequate in terms of employers practising bogus self-employment, but that there is in fact an incentive and a danger. And if you could just comment further on that question of perverse incentive. So are we basically in danger of creating a wrong incentive where in fact there is a reward for employers, and I think you make that very clear. In terms of the deterrent, it was very striking. It's been very striking, the huge lack of prosecution and the lack of taking things forward. I think about 21 cases in the last few years, and none, as I understand it, in 2017. Even this, despite the fact that, as I think you had, such a huge cohort of the main areas of work in the state are affected by this, and that we're looking at rates, as you said, of about almost a quarter of those in construction. Specifically in relation to construction, Mr. Wall, you might comment on, it was interesting to see the Revenue Commissioner actions in 2017 that are discussed there, where you had a large number of subcontractors reclassified as employees, and yet later on we learn that we have now 6,000 more in that sector. If you could kind of comment, because it helps us to think about how we can really interrogate sectoral investigations, because one of the things we discussed it was the issue whereby individuals are taking cases and they may or may not have satisfaction, but a big concern was that these individual cases are not extending into sectoral analysis and really wide-scale change. So, for example, if one employee of a company engaged in a type of work brings forward a case, that should, of course, trigger a wider review of both that company and indeed of that sector. So maybe if you talk about having had that investigation, and did it or did it not have the ripple effects. I think it's also it's very striking in terms of the loss to the state as well. Not simply in terms of those who may end up dependent on other forms of income, the loss to the active economy, but also in terms of pensions. If perhaps you might comment on the long-term impact of bogus self-employment, particularly in a climate where we now know that we are likely to move to a requirement for example, 30 pension contributions for a full pension, or as is sometimes touted, 40, but I'm hopeful that we will be able to keep it at 30 pension contributions. In terms of it, so I imagine that this is putting a huge cohort of persons out of reach of that pension. I had one area where I had a question. I kind of have concerns. I've heard it spoken about. The suggestion that has been made by the Minister around making principal contractors liable. While I can see potential positive things in regards to some aspects of this, in that I think quality employment should be reflected in all contracting and tendering processes, and an expectation of quality, and indeed an expectation of progression in employment should be seen. I do have questions and concerns in relation to this issue in certain areas. And so, for example, in areas like where we have public procurement, and perhaps you might comment specifically on public procurement and how it should be ensuring that it is not contributing to bogus self-employment. And I'd really appreciate if you could identify 2 or 3 areas of public procurement where that could be tackled, because that's something we have a great scope to tackle. There is potential there in terms of quality public procurement, but in terms of this specific proposal, I am concerned in relation to the question of liability. So, for example, if in the construction area you look at the area like home renovation, if you have a situation whereby the individual who's renovating their home is somehow the person liable for PRSI, is there a danger of that in this proposal, whereby basically we're distancing again, employers are almost getting off the hook again, and we have individuals, because it's very, of course, difficult for an employee or somebody named as a self-contractor who is in fact an employee to really take action against individual small contractors, if you know what I mean, are contracting rather than those that they are effectively working for. So I have concerns around that proposal, that it distances us. My last two questions in relation to the Workplace Relation Committee and the Labour Courts. I think it's very positive, the idea of bringing them into the process, certainly if not replacing scope. In terms of, at the moment, we've seen that scope is appealed back to the department, and that's not the right phrase. But if you've had trouble, we've heard cases of people having difficulty because they're almost in two processes at the same time, trying to navigate the labour courts and at the same time trying to navigate the process around their registration. If you could just comment on that, would be very. And then finally, just to Mr. Dooley, I know that you have worked extensively with many people in the arts. And I know I spoke last week in terms of precarious employment in the arts, where it is, endemic, and particularly contracting. Have you found, for example, the competition amendment bill put forward by my colleagues here on the committee, and that the collective bargaining possibilities in that area, has that in any way assisted in terms of tackling this issue in that sector? Thank you.
Very much.